Welcome to Present Perfect. No grammar, but plenty of history. I'm Don Congdon, your host and guide, helping you explore how the past reaches out and touches the present. This is podcast number 101. Today we begin by laying some groundwork and establishing a few principles to govern the way that we handle this subject. Above all, I want you to have a clear sense of my objectives and philosophy. First of all, I need to emphasize that while this is a church history podcast, it doesn't always follow the rules of academic history. What do I mean by this? Academic history has 4 key goals: determining the facts of history, interpreting those facts, establishing cause and effect relationships between historical events, and communicating those findings through writing and teaching. Ideally, an academic historian doesn't judge history, nor does he comment on the morality of historical events. He avoids spending too much time exploring what-if questions, and he resists the temptation to go down those what-should-have-happened rabbit trails. Instead, it's the historian's goal to present as coherent and unbiased a presentation of history as possible. These are wise and appropriate goals since they help historians avoid pointless tangents and excessive personal bias. Of course, I am not for a minute claiming that academic historians are perfectly objective and unbiased scholars. No human being can achieve this state. All people, historians included, have opinions and can become extremely passionate about them. It's for this reason that I'm going to be open about my own interpretational assumptions and biases. But to come back to our original topic, how am I going to approach this subject if not in the traditional academic way? First of all, I'll be breaking the rules to a limited degree. That's always fun. While I will indeed discuss the facts of history, interpret them, and explore cause and effect relationships, I'll also do a certain amount of evaluation. I'll occasionally venture into a what-if question, and I might even pose a few what-should-have-happened opinions. Why do I feel this is appropriate? For the simple reason that the subject we're dealing with is not a purely theoretical matter. Church history is the record of people's responses to events that God brought into their lives. Some of their decisions and actions were good, while others were unquestionably bad. And quite a few were not necessarily bad, but just poor or ineffective. Those collective actions have brought us to the moment in history in which we now live. We experience the consequences, both good and evil, of each decision made by those who have come before us. Consequently, it makes sense to evaluate those decisions with the benefit of hindsight. We do this not to self-righteously judge or condemn our predecessors, but rather to help us avoid their mistakes. And we can profit from their good actions, using them to encourage us to make right decisions. Similarly, it makes sense for us to consider how our own world might have been different if people had made other decisions. We do this not as a pointless speculation game, but to help us reflect on the consequences of our own actions. After all, someday we too will be historical figures, and people not yet born may have to live with the consequences of what we've done. So in a way, I'll be taking an approach to history that is both academic and philosophical. I call it applied history. Now that we've gotten that out of the way, let's take a few minutes to talk about history. Even though I will occasionally break the rules of historical study, this is a history podcast, so I need to lay down some basic grounding in the subject before we go any further. First of all, I acknowledge that history is not everyone's favorite topic. Perhaps you're in this category. Maybe a high school or college history textbook was like a trek through the Sahara Desert. Or perhaps you had an uninspiring teacher who portrayed history as nothing more than an endless string of facts to memorize. If that's the case, try to set those impressions aside and approach this podcast with an open mind. I know it's hard, but you can do it. Church history is an exciting topic because it's one that's timeless. While the people of church history lived different lives, ate different food, and did some weird things, they were still people just like you and me. They too wondered what God expected of them. They too had to deal with a world filled with uncertain politics, difficult economic times, illness, and personal challenges. Their churches had plenty of power struggles, unchristian behavior, sin, and doctrinal controversy. And for most of the church's history, there was relatively little religious or political freedom. I live in a city with several hundred churches, but that situation didn't exist through most of church history. If your church had a problem or you disagreed with what it taught, you probably had nowhere else to go. And that's why some people became the outliers of history as they rose up and challenged the establishment. In some cases, their efforts came to nothing. In others, they caused great controversy, sometimes generating significant historical change. Some lost their lives in the process. But church history isn't just about the famous people who made it into the textbooks. It's about countless, quiet, ordinary people who held beliefs and acted on them. In many cases, they're not the names we remember today, but they did what they believed to be right. In some cases, they were deeply and sincerely wrong. In others, they advanced the cause of Christ within their own time. In a few cases, their actions had a wider effect. As we delve into history, let's try to keep the people in mind. Don't think of them as the caricatures that come down to us from children's biographies and devotional studies. Saintly heroes all in white battling it out with black-hatted villains who always seem to sport pointed beards. Think of them as ordinary people with all the flaws and virtues that people have today, trying to live within their own time to the best of their ability. In our next podcast, we're going to examine the raw material of history, facts. You may be surprised to learn how slippery they can be. We'll take a look at what we know as well as what we don't. We'll explore sources of historical fact and the way in which we evaluate them. And I'll discuss the idea of factual confidence and its role in historical study. And that's all for now. So until next time, I'm Don Congdon, and this is Present Perfect. Have a great day. Present Perfect is a copyright of Don Congdon. Music is copyright Footage Firm Incorporated. Scripture quotations are from the New American Standard Bible, which is a copyright of the Lockman Foundation.